Welcome to Learning Thursdays. I'm Dean Hale with the OASAS Learning and Development Unit and your host for today's presentation. Today's presentation is titled Introduction to the Safe and Together Model. And joining me today is Bonnie Allen, Assistant Director of Community Outreach for the Office of Prevention of Domestic Violence. She'll be joining me in a moment, but first a word about Learning Thursdays. Learning Thursdays are offered to behavioral health professionals as a free learning opportunity with the goal of improving the knowledge and skills of the New York State substance use disorder workforce as we strive to improve the lives of individuals needing prevention, treatment, recovery, and harm reduction services. A goal of Learning Thursdays is to support the professional development of the treatment, prevention, recovery, and harm reduction workforce. We do this by offering regular presentations that are relevant to today's substance use disorder treatment professional. As always, if there are any questions, comments, or suggestions, please feel free to contact us at the Learning Thursdays mailbox. You can use the same mailbox to express an interest in providing a future Learning Thursdays program. And now it's time to start the presentation and welcome our presenter. Welcome, Bonnie.
Good morning, everyone. I'm happy to be here with you today. My name is Bonnie Allen, and I've worked with the New York State Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence for 10 years now. A lot of my work has been around the intersections of domestic violence and health. And so I've done a lot of work around looking at how domestic violence intersects with substance use and mental health and overall health across the lifetime. I'm here today to introduce you to the Safe and Together model. It is a model that I am very fond of. I think it lends itself to really addressing domestic violence and provides a way for all systems to address domestic violence. So today I'm going to give you an introduction and an overview of this model. Prior to coming to OPDV, I did a lot of work in domestic violence shelters, working with victims and their children. I worked with offenders and perpetrators of domestic violence, and I've done a lot of systems work. So really helping other systems to recognize and see how domestic violence shows up in their workplace and how they can respond in ways to keep survivors safe and respond in ways that are effective and also holding perpetrators accountable. And I think this model really lends itself to the complexities of domestic violence, and particularly for people who are for substance use professionals. There's so many intersections with domestic violence and substance use. And so I'm excited to be here and introduce this model to you today. So the mission of the Safe and Together Institute is to create, nurture, and sustain a global network of domestic violence-informed child welfare professionals, communities, and systems. I really like the mission of Safe and Together because although this is a child welfare model, the mission really lets us know that this is not just about one system. It's not just about the child welfare system. We want all of our communities and all of our systems to be responding to domestic violence in ways that are domestic violence informed. A little bit later in the presentation, I'm going to introduce you to a tool that the Safe and Together model provides called the Domestic Violence Informed Continuum. And it's really a great assessment about how to move our practice so that we are domestic violence informed. So often we may be working with a family or an individual who has experienced domestic violence or is experiencing domestic violence, and we may not even be aware of that. So we want all professionals and all communities to always keep in mind that that person that you're working with and engaging with may be experiencing domestic violence or may be perpetrating domestic violence. So we want all of your engagement and interactions with families and individuals to be domestic violence informed. And I think their mission really speaks to that. The Safe and Together model is a global model. It is really operating across the world. This slide, I think, is back from 2017, so it has even increased more now. I attended a certification program to be a Safe and Together trainer. That was a year-long process to accomplish that goal, and I had the privilege of sitting in training with people from Ohio and New Mexico and Colorado, and really had the advantage of seeing how different states are looking at this model and how they can use the model. We're very fortunate in New York State because the Office of Children and Family Services has really committed to this model and is introducing the model to all child protective service workers, investigators, foster care workers, anyone doing child welfare work through OCFS is learning about this model. It's not being mandated, so counties are coming to this in their own pace and in a way that feels right for their counties. But we really are very fortunate to be partnering with OCFS to introduce this model. The model also operates in Canada, the UK, Australia has one of the largest and longest in practice Safe and Together network. And not only are all of their child welfare workers trained in this, but also their family court judges. So Australia really, we kind of look to them as a model of what we would like to see in New York State. I currently am working in partnership with OCFS in addition to training all of their brand new workers that are coming in to do this work. We are making sure that every worker in the state is also getting trained, at least in the one-day overview of this model. So that's really exciting, and hopefully we can follow in Australia's footsteps and get all of our other systems trained as well. I want to take a minute to provide you with a little bit of data that the Safe and Together model provides, just to kind of set the stage for understanding domestic violence, how it shows up, and how it shows up particularly in the child welfare system. We know that as many as 2 in 3 child fatalities or critical incidents have domestic violence as a factor. That is not to say that domestic violence is the cause of that fatality or that critical incident. It may not be that direct. But what this shows us is that domestic violence is playing a role when children are harmed or when there are child fatalities. I always, I hate every time I see this statistic and it says child fatalities. It's no matter how many times I do this training, that's always jarring to me. The place where I get hope in this data is if we can do better at addressing and responding to domestic violence, then maybe we have the option of preventing child fatalities and critical incidents. I believe that the Safe and Together model and behaving in ways that are domestic violence informed and proficient and competent will help us to hopefully reduce some of the worst cases that we see related to domestic violence. Another important statistic, I think, is that the vast majority of perpetrators of domestic violence still see their children. One study found that 70% see their children frequently. Oftentimes we want to believe that if that survivor would just leave, we hear it all the time, right? Why don't they just leave? Why don't they just leave? They should just leave. If it were me, I would leave. And what we know is that, first of all, leaving is the most dangerous thing for a victim of domestic violence to do. They are at the highest risk of lethality when they are in the process of leaving and up until 2 years after they have left. And part of the reason it is that when a survivor chooses to leave, the perpetrator doesn't just magically disappear, right? That perpetrator oftentimes is still seeing their children, may get supervised or unsupervised visits, may get 50% custody, may be providing childcare so that survivor can go to work. Oftentimes there are financial ties and housing ties. And so perpetrators continue to see their children and often are using their children as tactics of coercive control to still, through post-separation abuse, be abusive to that surviving parent. The Safe and Together model really recognizes that the child's safety is tied to the safety of that adult survivor. And it is saying that if the children can see that perpetrator in ways that is safe, right? Sometimes that's what survivors want. Sometimes survivors and children want to see that perpetrating parent. We just want to make sure and try to ensure in every way we can that they are seeing that perpetrating parent in a safe environment, right? And so if we know that perpetrators are going to continue to see their children, we want to engage with and work with perpetrators, right? So that they can do that in ways that are safe and that promote the health, safety, and well-being of their children. We know that 40 to 75% of children in caseloads who are exposed to domestic violence are also victims of physical violence. So there is a huge intersection of physical and child abuse and neglect, and even child sexual abuse and domestic violence. And so we want to always keep that in mind. To me, when I train law enforcement, healthcare providers, judges, home visiting staff, I always let them know, if you know that there's domestic violence in that home, it is highly likely that there is also physical or sexual violence of those children, or maybe child neglect. And if you know that child neglect or physical or sexual violence is present, it is highly likely that there is also domestic violence in that family as well. So it's important to keep in mind those intersections. And again, the Safe and Together model, right, is designed for child welfare workers because that is so connected, right? That those kids that are in our CPS system and in our child welfare system as victims of abuse may also be experiencing domestic violence. And the other thing that's really critical to know is that we know that the National Survey for Child and Adolescent Wellbeing data, this was back in 2013. They redid this study again in 2020, and the data was very similar. Rates of recent domestic violence incidents disclosed by parents were more than double what child welfare workers identified. So what this really speaks to is that our child welfare system is missing these cases. Survivors oftentimes don't disclose that they're experiencing domestic violence. They may not even understand or recognize that what they're experiencing is domestic violence. They may not have that label for it. So you may say, are you a victim of domestic violence? And they say no, because they don't recognize and understand that that's what they're experiencing. Oftentimes we think of domestic violence as only physical violence. And really, domestic violence doesn't have to be physical. It's that coercive controlling behavior, the threats, the intimidation, the financial abuse, the isolation. And so oftentimes survivors are not disclosing because they don't recognize. Survivors may also not disclose because they are ashamed, they're embarrassed. Oftentimes perpetrators tell them, this is your fault, right? Anything that's happened in this family is because there's something wrong with you. And so survivors oftentimes start to think that it is their fault. And so a lot of shame and embarrassment, another reason why they may not disclose to us. They also might be afraid. If a survivor has had an interaction or engagement with the system in the past, maybe child welfare, maybe family court, maybe law enforcement, and they have not been believed, or things have gotten worse for them because of that engagement or interaction with the system, they are going to be less likely to trust the system and confide in the worker that's working with them. I want to be very, very clear that it is not only child welfare workers that are missing these cases. All of our systems are missing these cases. Law enforcement, family court, mental health programs, substance use programs, right? Oftentimes we are missing these cases. I think using the Safe and Together model in terms of partnering with survivors and holding offenders accountable and engaging with perpetrators is all going to help us to build systems where survivors can see us as a resource and are more likely to confide in us what's going on, which then will allow us to help them better. This is the Safe and Together model, better outcomes for families and systems. That is our goal, right? We want to see safety, well-being, and permanency for children. We want to have better assessments, better partnerships, and better case plans. So when we're engaging with families in ways that are domestic violence informed, we are going to have improved competencies and improved cross-system collaboration. Right. So the foundation of this model is the model characteristics, the principles, and the critical components of those models. I'm going to be talking to you about those briefly. The model has very specific strategies and tools that you can use and that child welfare workers can use. There's a mapping tool that really takes all of the perpetrators' behaviors and tactics of coercive control and maps them onto how the survivor is impacted, how the child is impacted, as well as how the family functioning is impacted. A lot of professionals across disciplines really like that mapping tool. Pivoting is the idea that we are constantly pivoting back to the perpetrator of domestic violence as the source of risk and harm. This model recognizes always, it's a perpetrator pattern-based approach, and it recognizes that the perpetrator is the source of risk and harm, and we want to always be focusing back to that perpetrator as the one that is causing harm, and we want to be looking at the survivor's decisions and choices in the context of that perpetrator's pattern of behavior. So that's pivoting, always pivoting back. It can be really easy to get focused on the survivor and what they're doing or not doing. And then we have this very slippery slope of what becomes focusing on the survivor and then becomes blaming the survivor or holding the survivor responsible for the perpetrator's behavior. So we always want to be pivoting back to that perpetrator as the source of risk and harm. The model also offers a case planning guide, a supervisor matrix, and a pathways and planning tools. So there's a lot of really hands-on tools that people can use. And all of those things, improving our competencies, improving cross-system collaboration is going to lead to better assessments, better partnerships, better case plans, and that is going to give us the better outcomes that we want for children and families. So this is the domestic violence informed continuum that I was mentioning to you and talking to you about. You can see that this continuum runs from right to left, left to right. So we can go anywhere from domestic violence destructive to domestic violence neglectful to domestic violence pre-competent, competent, and proficient. So when we're training child welfare workers, we are always encouraging that they are moving their practice towards the right side of that continuum, that they are always striving to be domestic violence proficient. When a system is domestic violence proficient, it recognizes that that domestic violence is not just an issue about the adults. It recognizes that children are impacted even if they don't see or hear the violence, and that they have the potential to be harmed even if they're not present, right? And so it moves us from that destructive practice that this is only an adult issue to really recognizing and understanding that this is also a children's issue and that children are impacted by domestic violence. When we're doing domestic violence destructive, we're using that failure to protect approach where we're focusing on the adult survivor and their failure to protect the children, as opposed to looking at the perpetrator as the source of risk and harm and constantly focusing on the perpetrator's behavior, right? So we're moving away from that blaming the victim for failing to protect the children and focusing on the perpetrator's pattern of behavior and the harm that that causes to children. Another part of being domestic violence proficient is really understanding all of the things that survivors are often doing to protect and keep their kids safe. And when we look at their choices and decisions in the context of the perpetrator's pattern of behavior, we start to see that oftentimes, almost always in my experience, survivors are constantly, every day, almost everything they do is designed to protect and keep the kids safe while they are experiencing this coercive controlling abuse. In a domestic violence destructive or neglectful practice, oftentimes the father is invisible. The model really uses gender responsive language. So up until this point, I have been talking about victims, survivors, offenders, and perpetrators. And I have not been assigning any gender to that language. And the reason we do that is that we know anyone, male or female, can be a victim or a perpetrator of domestic violence. So we use that gender neutral language so that we know men can also be victims of female perpetrators, of male perpetrators. We know women can be perpetrators as well. So we use that gender neutral language. However, sometimes the Safe and Together model uses more gender responsive language, which reflects what child welfare workers are often seeing on their cases, which is that mom is the victim and the father is the perpetrator. All of our data really shows us that although we know men can be victims of domestic violence, that women are more likely to be victims and often experience more severe and long-term consequences as a result. So there are parts of the Safe and Together model that slip into using that more gender responsive language because that's really reflects what child welfare workers are seeing in most of their cases. And this is a place where they do that. So they talk about fathers being invisible. As a society, we tend to have very high standards for mothers as parents. And that's not to take away from the fact that we know we have very many wonderful fathers out there that are doing amazing, incredible jobs, either in partnership with others or as single fathers. So I don't ever want to take away from that. But as a society, we tend to hold moms up to a higher standard than dads. If we want to know, did the children get their vaccines? Who's the child's teacher? Why isn't that child dressed appropriately? Why don't they have their lunch money? We tend to go immediately to why isn't the mother taking care of those things? This model really wants us to make fathers visible and have very high standards for fathers. And so we want both parents to be responsible for the health, safety, and well-being of their children. And so when we are being domestic violence proficient or competent on that right side of the continuum, we have high expectations for fathers, and we expect that fathers are going to be contributing to the health, safety, and well-being of their children in the same ways that we expect mothers to. The other part, oftentimes when we're working with perpetrators, we may not be engaging with them. Oftentimes perpetrators may be trying to avoid systems. Sometimes workers are trying to avoid perpetrators, right? We may be afraid, we may think it's not safe for us to deal with them. This model really requires that we are engaging with fathers, that we are engaging with perpetrators. Even if there's an order of protection, or even if the family has already been separated, we need to make that father or that perpetrator visible to the criminal court system. So even if they're avoiding us every single time we call, I always tell child welfare workers, reach out to that perpetrating parent. Say, hi, this is so-and-so. I would like to schedule a meeting or a phone call so that we can talk about the health, safety, and well-being of your children. Please call me back at da-da-da-da-da. And then documenting every single time you called that person to talk about the health, safety, and well-being of their children. And even if you never see that person, they never call you back, they never come into your office, they skip every single appointment with you, you have no contact with them, that father or that perpetrator is now visible in your documentation, because over and over and over again, you say, Mr. Smith did not return my call on X, Y, and Z to discuss the health, safety, and well-being of their children. Right. And so that person who you may never see now is visible when Mr. Smith goes to court and says, I want custody of my kids. It is very clear when the judge is looking at those case notes that Mr. Smith has done nothing, not even contacted the worker to discuss the health, safety, and well-being of the children. So we want perpetrators to be visible. That is domestic violence proficient practice. Oftentimes we have biases about survivors. Unfortunately, we have deeply ingrained biases about domestic violence, about survivors, about perpetrators. And so sometimes in a destructive or neglectful practice, it comes to be that it's the child versus the adult survivor, right? The mother must not care. I'll use mother as survivor. You know, they don't care about their kids, right? Their partner is more important. Maintaining their relationship is more important than their children. They're not protecting their kids. Those are all destructive and neglectful statements and practices. And we want to move away from that. And we want to recognize that that child's safety and well-being is often tied to the safety and well-being of that survivor. And again, we want to have that strength-based approach where we really understand that oftentimes in the context of the perpetrator's behavior, that survivor is doing an amazing job, right? With very limited, oftentimes, choices and ability to make decisions because of the perpetrator's behavior in keeping that child safe, right? So we want to always be moving our practice to that domestic violence proficient practice, right? Where we recognize the impact on the children. We recognize that it's the perpetrator's behavior that's causing harm, where we have high standards for perpetrators and fathers, and where we recognize that the child's safety is often tied to the safety and well-being of the adult survivor. These are the primary principles of the model. There's 3 principles. The first one is keeping the child safe and together with the non-offending parent. In the safe and together model, we really recognize that domestic violence is not just about physical violence or abuse, but we are really talking here, when we're talking about keeping kids safe, we're talking about keeping them emotionally safe as well as physically safe. We're talking about helping them heal from the trauma of domestic violence. And we recognize that oftentimes when there is stability and nurturance, that and connection to that one positive adult, that is what helps children heal from the trauma and helps children to both feel emotionally and physically safe. The second principle is partnering with the non-offending parent as the default position. So this is a very survivor-centered approach. And what we recognize is that, or what we want people to recognize, and what the Safe and Together model really promotes, is that surviving parent is the expert in their life. That survivor parent is the one that knows better than anyone what tactics that perpetrator is using. They know what relationship the perpetrator has with the children. They know better than anyone what has kept those children safe in the past and what has caused harm or risk to the family and the children. So it is really efficient and effective for us to partner with that survivor. They have a lot of information that can help caseworkers and other professionals understand what's happening in that family. They can guide us in the best way to approach the perpetrating parent. They can tell us some of the strengths of that perpetrating parent. They can tell us what the relationship is. Maybe they have 3 children, right? Maybe the perpetrator is really great with the 2-year-old and the 4-year-old little boy, but the 13-year-old daughter and the perpetrator are like this. right? That survivor has really more information than anyone. So we want to always be partnering with that survivor. We want to trust them as the expert in their life and their circumstances. And we want to partner with them to help guide our practice and what we're doing and how we're engaging. That survivor will help us to keep that family safe. They really know best. The third principle is intervening with the perpetrator to reduce risk and harm to child. Again, I think many systems oftentimes are not engaging with that perpetrator. They may not see that perpetrator is not showing up. This model requires that child welfare workers are engaging with and attempting to engage with perpetrators. The perpetrator is the one that's causing the harm, yet so often we don't engage with that perpetrator and we focus on the survivor, and we put all of the responsibility on the survivor for protecting and keeping those children safe, right? And then we tend to lose sight of the fact that it's the perpetrator, right, that's causing the risk of harm and safety to the children. So we really want to engage with that perpetrator. As I said earlier, if that perpetrator is doing everything to avoid us, we still want to be documenting all of our attempts to engage with and work with that perpetrator. We want to be engaging with them as a parent, and we want to help that perpetrator to understand that the choice that they're making to be abusive to their intimate partner or the parent of their children is a parenting choice, and it is a parenting choice that is causing harm to the children. We know, and research has told us, that one of the ways that perpetrators are motivated to change their abusive behavior is when they start to understand the impact that their behavior is having on their children. So we want to always be trying to engage with that perpetrator to educate them about the impact of their behavior on the children. I did offender accountability work for many years, and I can say that in my experiences, this is a place where perpetrators can understand. Oftentimes, perpetrators may have also grown up in homes where they experienced domestic violence, not always, and we can't allow that to be an excuse for their behavior, but they learned this behavior sometime. And so when we start to tie their behavior and the harm that it's causing to the children, we can start to see some motivation, because that's not what they want for their children, right? When we ask perpetrators of domestic violence, just like we ask any other parent, right, what do you want for your children? Oftentimes they want all the same things that any parent wants. So then it's engaging with them as parents and educating them about the harm that they're causing and letting them know very clearly that they can change their behavior, right? This is not about being punitive or abusive to perpetrators. That doesn't get us anywhere, but letting them know that their behavior is causing harm and they can choose different behavior that will increase safety, health, and well-being for their children. We're also engaging with perpetrators in ways to hold them accountable for their behavior. We want to there's no excuse for their abusive behavior, right? They may have experienced trauma as a child. They may have a mental health or substance use problem, right? All of those things may need to be addressed, but they are not excuses for their abusive behavior. So we need to constantly be letting perpetrators know there's no excuse for your behavior. You're making a choice, and you can make a different choice that will make things better for your children. The ways that we as child welfare workers can hold perpetrators accountable, and I think this is true, I think also for mental health and substance use providers, is that we can constantly hold them accountable to any conditions that they have that they're aware of. We can encourage them to abide by any orders or protections, probation or parole conditions. We can talk to them about how they are causing harm to their children. We can put in place case plans that are very behavior specific, that require them to do certain things that are in the best interest of the children and to not do other things, to not be verbally abusive or physically abusive, or restrict access to transportation or healthcare or medical needs or family members. Right. So through our case plans, through our engagement, we can really work with perpetrators to hold them accountable. And how we document and engage with perpetrators can also provide information to the courts, right? And sometimes to law enforcement, sometimes to other programs where we may be making referrals, so that those other programs can also hold that perpetrator accountable. Like I said earlier, if we're documenting the perpetrators in the refusal to work with us, then we're providing that court with information so that they can hold that perpetrator accountable, right? Maybe they can issue an order of protection. Maybe they can order an offender accountability program. Maybe they can have someone incarcerated. Maybe they can order mental health or substance use treatment, right? So we want all systems working together to hold perpetrators accountable, and so that other systems are able to do that. We may be referring, right, to mental health or substance use treatment. That referral is going to be more beneficial and helpful if we can provide the information that we know about the perpetrator's pattern of behavior and the tactics that that perpetrator is using. So intervening with perpetrators also helps with that cross-system collaboration that we want. These are the critical components of the model. These are the pieces of I would say kind of the pieces of the puzzle that if we want to have a clear and accurate picture of what's happening in this family, we need to know all of these pieces. Again, I think this is a great self-assessment tool. If I can't answer questions about each of these things, I'm missing something and I need to go back and do more work. I need to have a very clear and accurate picture of the perpetrator's pattern of coercive control. I need to have an understanding of all of the tactics that this perpetrator is using to gain and maintain power and control over the survivor. Are they using isolation? Are they not allowing access to health care? Are they being verbally and mentally abusive? Are they threatening to harm the children or the family pets or to take the children out of the country? What are the tactics that this perpetrator is using in the current situation and relationship? But what tactics have they also used in the past? Even going back to other relationships. Unfortunately, we know that oftentimes we have perpetrators who have multiple victims, and child welfare oftentimes may see the same families over time, same perpetrator, different victims. So having a real accurate picture across time and over time of the perpetrator's pattern of coercive control is really critical to understand what's happening. Because we're going to look at those survivors and decisions and choices, right, in the context of those tactics that that perpetrator is using. We also need to know what actions the perpetrator has taken to cause direct harm to the child. That's that intersection of child abuse and neglect and domestic violence, right? Is this perpetrator also being physically or sexually abusive to their children? Are they being neglectful to their child in any way? We need to have that information. We need to have a clear picture of the full spectrum of the non-offending parent's efforts to promote child safety and well-being. What is that survivor parent doing on a daily basis to keep those children safe and to promote their health and well-being? Survivors have tremendous, tremendous strengths. It can be so easy to focus on what they're not doing, right? Instead of focusing on the perpetrator and the harm that they're causing. We want to focus on survivors and we want to identify all of their strengths, right? If they are able to get those kids up in the morning and get them to school and have them dressed well, even though the perpetrator kept them up all night, accusing them of having affairs, that is a strength, right? Maybe that perpetrator is using sleep deprivation, not allowing that survivor to sleep at night, yet somehow that survivor still gets up every single day and makes sure that those kids get to school. Do the kids have all of their medical vaccines, their medical appointments, right? Because oftentimes maybe that perpetrator is not allowing them access to transportation, isn't giving them money for co-pays, isn't giving them access to the insurance cards, right? So when they are able to accomplish those things, that shows tremendous strength. Maybe the perpetrator is using financial abuse, doesn't give them enough money to provide for the basic needs of the children. That survivor may have to borrow money. That survivor may have to try to get a job that the perpetrator doesn't know about when the perpetrator's at work to earn some extra money. Survivors are incredibly resourceful and oftentimes are promoting child safety and well-being while they are experiencing horrific coercive control. And so we want to be very clear about that. Even if that survivor is making an attempt to keep the child safe, and even if that attempt fails, we want to recognize that an attempt was made. If that survivor tried to pull the child out of the room and put the child to bed when the perpetrator's behavior was escalating, right? Maybe the perpetrator didn't allow it to happen, but the survivor tried. We want to document that that survivor made an attempt to remove the children from the situation, right? We want to be very focused on all of their protective efforts. We want to understand the impact of the perpetrator's behavior on the child, right? All of those tactics that that perpetrator is using to gain and maintain control of the adult survivor, they are also using those are also having an impact on the child, right? So if I'm isolating my partner and not allowing her to see family and friends, it is likely then that my children are not going to be able to engage with and see family and friends. And really looking at when kids are isolated in that way, they don't have connection to family, they don't have connection to friends. What are the impacts of that, right? Maybe they're angry, maybe they're depressed. The impacts are going to be different for an infant than a 5-year-old and an adolescent. So this is really about mapping that perpetrator's pattern of behavior, the tactics that they're using on the adult survivor, and really looking at how are those tactics impacting the children. And then another part of the model that I really like is it really recognizes the intersections of domestic violence with mental health and substance use and those foundational identities of gender, culture, race, religion, ethnicity, socioeconomic status. And it recognizes that perpetrators are often using survivors' mental health, substance use, culture, economic factors as tactics of coercive control. And we know that for many survivors, if they do have a substance use issue or a mental health issue, or maybe they're in this country undocumented, maybe their faith or religion doesn't allow them access to certain services, or they don't feel comfortable accessing certain services, perpetrators will use those things, right? They will use them as tactics, and sometimes those intersections and intersectionalities make it really difficult for survivors to access services and support. So it's critical when we're looking at and trying to get a picture of what's going on in this family that we are looking at what is the role of those intersections and intersectionalities playing. How are perpetrators using them, and how do they sometimes make it more difficult for survivors to access services and support? The goal here is to have all of this information and then to be documenting this information, right? So that other systems that we're referring to, the family court system, maybe a case ends up in criminal court, right? That we can then take this complete and accurate picture and provide it to the systems who are making safety decisions for children. If there is a judge, right, or an attorney for the child, or a forensic court examiner, right, that's going to be making decisions, safety decisions for children, I want them to have all of the pieces of this puzzle. I want them to have as much and detailed, accurate information as possible. So when they're deciding, am I going to incarcerate this person? Am I going to issue an order of protection? Am I going to remove the children from this home, right? I want them to have all the pieces of the puzzle. Multiple pathways to harm is this idea that children are not always harmed directly and immediately as a result of a domestic violence incident, but that there are many pathways, oftentimes indirect pathways, where children are harmed. So we're going to start by looking at the perpetrator's pattern of coercive control, right? What are the tactics that they are using to control that adult survivor? And what actions, if any, are they taking that do cause direct harm to the children? So we're going to start there, right? Identifying that perpetrator's pattern of behavior. The harm that comes to the child, right? It could be behavioral, it could be emotional, it could be social, educational, developmental, physical injury, long-term health impacts. There are multiple ways that children can be harmed. We see children that may start regressing, right? They may have been potty trained and now they're bedwetting. They may not be showing up to school because they're afraid of what's going to happen to one of their parents when they're in school. They may be depressed. They may be anxious. They may not have friends. They may be bullying or be bullied, right? There may be a lot of educational disruptions, right? We know that trauma and domestic violence as trauma can cause developmental delays, can impact how the brain develops. And also the more direct are those physical injuries as a result of an incident, right? So there can be direct harm that happens immediately because of an incident, but a lot of times that harm may not come directly. It may come 3 months down the line, 3 weeks down the line, 5 years down the line. We know that the perpetrator's pattern of behavior can impact the survivor parent's parenting. We know that there are a lot of ways that the perpetrator's behavior and living and experiencing domestic violence can cause depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, substance use. Oftentimes, perpetrators are undermining the authority of the other parent, right? Commenting that that other parent is the one to blame, is always wrong, is stupid, being abusive to the children in front of them, right? Oftentimes, perpetrators are almost really... Sometimes children are learning to disrespect that other parent. Survivors are often spending a tremendous amount of time and energy to deal with the perpetrator. What kind of mood are they going to be in when they come home? Did I do everything the way they asked me to do it? How am I going to keep my kids safe if they come home and they're starting to be aggressive or violent or abusive? Perpetrators often will interfere with the day-to-day routine and basic care of the children. If that perpetrator is demanding attention and time and is acting out in a way that's controlling or aggressive or abusive, that may interfere with the survivor's ability to meet the children's most basic needs. If that perpetrator is using financial abuse and doesn't allow that survivor access to financial resources, they may not be able to provide those for the children. The children, as I said, they may also be victims of physical or sexual abuse. It's really important to recognize, and I think this model does a really good job of this, even if the children don't see or hear violence or abuse, they are aware of what's happening in that home. They sense the mood, they sense the fear, they may see the aftermath of violence in terms of bruises, they may see broken furniture, broken cell phones, they may have to go to court, they may see law enforcement, they may overhear phone conversations between the survivor and other relatives. Children are aware of what's happening in their homes at all ages and have the potential to be impacted, even when they don't see or hear it, right? Just having the tension and the stress of that survivor parent in the home. Kids are so sensitive and pick up on that. They pay attention to everything, they hear everything, and so they are aware, really, I think, across all ages when there is abuse or control happening in their home. The perpetrator's behavior may lead to a loss of income. Oftentimes, they may interfere with the survivor's ability to get or keep a job. There's a lot of housing instability. Survivors may be trying to get out of that situation. They may go stay with family or friends for a while. They may successfully separate from that person and actually maybe get a new home, right? Based on knowing that they're going to get child support, that they're going to get maintenance or alimony, that perpetrator is going to have the kids on, every Wednesday and Friday when they have to go to work. And so maybe they've made that separation, and then post-separation abuse starts, and that perpetrator does not pay the rent, does not show up on the days that they're supposed to visit so the survivor can go to work. And so a lot of times what we see is not necessarily immediate homelessness, but we see housing instability over a period of years, and then ultimately that person may be homeless. Isolation is a tactic that people are really disconnected from their extended family and friends, so they have no support system. And oftentimes for children, there may be multiple moves. The perpetrator may not want the children to be in contact with other kids. They may insist on homeschooling. The child may be so anxious or so worried about what's happening that they can't focus on in school. Maybe they're late to school because, again, the perpetrator may be not allowing that survivor to sleep at night. All of these tactics that the perpetrator are using can cause harm to the children. And as you can see, it's not always direct. You may have a young child that grows up in a home and they seem to be functioning fine. And then they're an adolescent and they start engaging in risk-taking behavior, right? Maybe they start using substances. Maybe they start to feel really anxious. And so we start to see sometimes that harm comes significantly down the line. What we want to always do is recognize and tie that harm back to the behaviors that the perpetrator is choosing. The Safe and Together offers a tool called the mapping tool, and I mentioned that earlier. It is a tool that you identify all of the perpetrator's patterns of behavior, not just related to whatever incident brought them or situation brought them to your door, but really going back in time and looking at all of the tactics that they have used over time, over relationships, and taking each one of those tactics and identifying how did that tactic impact the survivor? How did it impact the survivor's parenting? How did it impact the children? So that when we are then ready to make a case or maybe go to family court or go to our supervisor, we can tie all of these impacts, right, and all of this harm and damage that has come to the children, we can tie it back to the perpetrator's pattern of behavior. And so this is a tool that Safe and Together provides. If you do their 4-day core training, you have access to this tool. And it's many systems, domestic violence service providers, attorneys, many systems have found this mapping tool to be very beneficial. Currently in New York State, Safe and Together, this is a map that OCFS provides. We work very closely with them. As I said, they are rolling this model out across the state. It's currently in 24 counties are learning about the Safe and Together model and beginning to implement it. Implementation can look very different in different counties. Some counties attended this 1-hour briefing that you're getting now. Then they sent some of their staff for the 1-day training. There's a full 7.5-hour training. So some counties are then sending their child welfare workers to that. And then they are committing to have all of their staff in their child welfare, county social services trained in the 4-day core of the model. So currently, OCFS is introducing this model or implementing this model in 24 counties. Westchester County, Orange County, and Sullivan are 3 of the counties that are currently rolling out the 4-day core training to all of their staff, which is fabulous. That's the hope for every county, that ultimately every county decides to introduce this model and the 4-day core to all of their training. The model also offers coaching. It's really a systems change and a culture change model. And so they don't want to just go in and do a 4-day training and walk out, right? So they offer coaching so that the OCFS is actually in that county, looking at some of the most difficult and challenging domestic violence cases and teaching and working with them so that they can implement the principles and components of the model into their practice on these most difficult cases. We have a lot of work to do. Oftentimes, there's a lot of focus when we're talking about domestic violence as only seeing it as physical. So we're constantly trying to reinforce that domestic violence is not only about physical abuse. It's about coercive control that really limits the survivor's freedoms and limits their ability to make choices and decisions, right? So we really need to continue to work past that. It's only physical violence and look at really that it is a way that perpetrators are limiting survivors' freedoms and ability to make choices and decisions. Oftentimes, it can be hard to identify those patterns of coercive control, particularly in court proceedings. So it's, again, that mapping tool and really tying and identifying all those tactics that perpetrator is using, right? And then looking at how is that impacting the children. The model really moves away, as I said, when we're talking about being domestic violence forum. This is not an adult issue. It is not a relationship issue, right? It is also the source of danger to children. And so we want to move it away from this is just between adults and children are not impacted. Children are impacted, and they're impacted even when they don't see it or hear it. Oftentimes it's very difficult when kids have not seen the violence, right? And they're all different ages, to tie together the impact on them to the perpetrator's pattern of behavior. And again, that's why it's really critical to look at all those behaviors that perpetrator is doing and not only see the impact on the survivor, but look at what is the impact on those children. And I think we need to understand that perpetrators can change their behaviors, they can make different choices, right? And that we really need to be engaging with them as parents and providing resources and support to encourage them to make different choices so that their children are not impacted in these ways. One of my favorite things about the model is that idea that domestic violence perpetration is a parenting choice, whether the children are there to witness it or not. I said early in my career, I worked in domestic violence programs. Though that first part of my career was really focused on providing counseling and support for children who had grown up in homes where there was domestic violence. And so very early in my career, I saw all of the ways that children are impacted. And then, like I said, I also had the opportunity to work with perpetrators. So I think this idea and educating perpetrators, right, that their decision to be abusive to their intimate partner is causing harm to their children, even if the children don't see it or hear it. I'm hopeful that this was valuable to all of you today. Please reach out in any way if possible. I can provide email addresses. I want to be able to answer any questions that anyone has at any point in time. And the New York State Domestic and Sexual Violence Hotline is also a great resource for you and the families that you're working with.
I want to thank Bonnie for joining me today. I hope you all find it useful while assisting clients in need of services. Your feedback is important to us. It helps us to know if we're meeting your educational goals and expectations. Once you've viewed the presentation in its entirety and completed the quiz, if prompted, please follow directions to access the SurveyMonkey website. Take a moment to complete the evaluation, including suggestions for any future topics for Learning Thursdays. Once again, thank you for joining us and keep up the good work.